Anime isn't real. I know, huge shocker. The characters aren't real. The places aren't real. Everything in the anime is not real. I know I'm breaking a lot of hearts here right now, but I'm speaking the truth. While anime is something that I'm sure most of you watching this video love to consume, and I love to consume myself, we have to remember that it is fictional at the end of the day. In case you've been living under a rock for the last, I don't know, your whole life, I'll go ahead and define fiction for you. Fiction is a narrative form in any medium that is not based on history or fact. In other words, it is completely imaginary. Now, this doesn't mean that it can't pull from reality. However, that does not mean that this is based upon reality or is it a reflection of such. Of course, certain pieces of fiction do intend to reflect reality. Whether it be that it's trying to make a statement or that it's trying to be as historically accurate as possible, the fact still remains that it is all fake at the end of the day. Now, why am I trying to stress the importance of what fiction is? Because it's important to understand the distinction between fiction and reality. To start off, I'm not trying to downplay the importance of fiction. I think fiction is a very important tool in life, and it can tell you very important life lessons. Some of the best pieces of fiction try to stay as close to reality as they possibly can. Take Breaking Bad, for example. The show is set in New Mexico, and is about drug lords, cartels, and drug use, all of which are major problems in the state. Now, obviously, New Mexico is a real place, which means that the show is basing itself upon reality. However, this does not mean that the show is trying to be parallel to reality or trying to be reality. Walter, Jesse, every single character in the show is fictional. None of them exist, and all of their actions are entirely fictional. The death, the drugs, all of it does not happen. And while many people seem to understand this when it's applied to actual television like Breaking Bad, the same can be said when it's applied to things like video games and anime. For whatever reason, video games and anime are typically to blame for violent tendencies in people solely because you can do far greater things in those mediums than you can in live action. By far greater, of course, I mean you can do far more brutal things, you can do far more imaginative things, maybe something that you couldn't see actually done to a real person in real life. I also think the case of video games is the level of interactivity you get, because people tend to equate the killing that you do in the game is you actually wanting to kill somebody in real life, which is just completely batshit insane. Outside sources like media or fiction should not be to blame for why somebody does the fucked up actions they do. Nobody should be allowed to cite Doom Eternal for why they went out and murdered their family, because that's just fucking stupid. That allows them a scapegoat, and that is where the problem begins. This in particular is the very basis of why we need to separate fiction and reality. By conflating fiction with reality, you allow these actual harmful people to have a scapegoat, or a place to shift the blame to. It's essentially removing the responsibility from these kinds of people. They don't have to take accountability for their actions because guess what? Video games cause them to do this. Oh, anime caused them to do this. Any piece of media caused them to do this, and if people tend to believe that, then guess what? Those media will get removed, removing people's entertainment, and the majority of the population that knows that this is fiction will have to suffer from it. While for the most part video games come out unscathed, anime, manga, and hentai are a different story. Take the recent bans in Australia. They banned light novels such as Goblin Slayer, Sword Art Online, and Eromanga Sensei for child exploitation. However, anybody with a brain, or that's read or watched these series, knows that there's no form of child exploitation happening in there. This is trying to place the blame on something else. If you rile up the crowd and tell them that there's child pornography or child exploitation happening in this series, then they're going to go ahead and believe you, because they're not going to want to go and verify for themselves, because they're not going to want to see that kind of content. Accusing anime and manga of doing such heinous things sets a very dangerous precedent in the coming years. While anime itself isn't banned in Australia, they're going to move on to more non-sexualized content. They're going to see a lolly character in a regular show fully dressed and think it's child pornography simply because it exists in this medium that they detest. However, if you are of this mindset, you must understand the problem is you. It is not the medium. If a series is doing something you dislike, then guess what? You can turn away and not watch it. You cannot read it because it isn't real. nothing is actually happening to anybody. Even if it is something that's particularly heinous or frowned upon in real life, it's happening in a fictional setting. Nobody is actually being harmed and nobody is being forced to watch it. And it is not up to you to decide what gets distributed or gets put out to the world. If you do not like what is being put out, then you're not the target audience. If you dislike how the first episode of Goblin Slayer went and you felt bad for the characters, well, I'm sorry, this might sound very fucked up, but those characters are not real. It's a very horrible thing that happened, obviously, and this show makes it a point to express that this is a very bad thing. That is why the villains of the show, the goblins, are doing such a horrible thing. Certain series utilize awful things that happen in the real world to drive forward the plot, to drive forward the narrative, to express how fucked up that world may be or how fucked up certain characters may be. The point being is that anything goes in fiction. Dark topics are allowed to be brought up in media. By removing that, we'll just have the same milquetoast, boring, and safe fictional pieces every single day. Nothing has to justify its reasoning for existing. Anybody can put out anything they want into the world, and we just have to accept that. I also really want to stress that an author writing something is not an endorsement of said thing. The inclusion of sensitive, real-world things does not mean the author actually endorses it. Almost every single anime that exists has murder in it, and I doubt any of those mangakas or series creators thinks that you should go out and just start murdering people. And a fan that is fond of these characters does not mean they endorse them either. My favorite villain of all time is Bonjud from Made in Abyss, and I think he is a fantastic character. He's super well written, he's super deep, and I just think he's a really just super cool character all around. However, guess what? This might be a shocker to everybody. I think child trafficking is wrong. I think child experimentation is wrong. I think everything Bonjud did was horrendously wrong. I do not endorse it in real life, and I hope to God nothing like that actually ever happens. It's okay to like these characters, however, though, so long as you don't actually idolize them. That's where the issue comes in, is that if you do start idolizing them, then you're the one to blame and not the piece of media, because they're never aiming to idolize said characters. If you like Kaji from Neon Genesis Evangelion, that is perfectly okay, so long as you don't actually idolize the things he does. He's written to be a bad person. He emotionally manipulates people for his own ends, and he does everything solely out of his own selfishness. But that's exactly what makes him a good, well-written character. But if you don't idolize those aspects of him, then you're perfectly fine to like him. It's when you do try to adopt those traits onto yourself is when the problem lies within you. The show never aims to make anybody in there look good. Neon Genesis Evangelion is a show entirely based around flawed characters. But flawed characters is what makes for fantastic writing. Shows like Monogatari and Re:Zero center around flawed people. It shows their ideals, it shows the way they think, and it deconstructs their flawed way of thinking. And some of the things they do are even very toxic, or they are very bad. And that's what makes it a very interesting series. In Monogatari, Araragi spends the whole series obsessing over saving everybody he possibly can. And because of this, he neglects to save himself, which is a very toxic thing, and the show makes sure to express this trait. You aren't supposed to try to replicate what Araragi does. Or how in Re:Zero, Subaru also has the same issue where he tries to save everybody. And because of this, he neglects to save his own life because he can return by death, as he mentions in the show, and he holds his life in very little regard. Thus, he thinks that it's just very disposable and that everybody else has more greater value than him. And he must spend the show coming to learn to love himself. Thus, anime can excel when it shows you things you don't want to see. These two series makes you reflect on parts of yourself you may never want to have reflected on. And other series even use aspects of reality to help you reflect on what happens in real life. If you're disturbed by what happens in Berserk or Goblin Slayer, then I have some news for you. That's the point. Both series use very fucked up things that happen in the real world and of course turn the dial up to 11. But it's supposed to make you look at these things and see that how awful they are. The rape and sexual assault scenes that happen in both series aren't there just because. They're supposed to exemplify how awful that world is. You aren't supposed to side with the person that's perpetrating these heinous acts. You aren't supposed to look at the goblins and Goblin Slayer and go, oh man, those are wonderful people, they're just misunderstood. No, they're doing awful things, and that just makes it all the more satisfying when Goblin Slayer comes in and kills them. Failing to understand why these types of things are included in series is just a fault of your own. It is a fault of you looking deeper into things. Looking at a series and seeing that it has sexual assault, murder, etc., you name it, and just dismissing it as a promotion of said things just means that you're failing to understand how storytelling works. Just because a story contains these kinds of graphic content does not mean it is promoting it. In fact, most of the time when these kinds of things are present in a story, it is there to detest it. But perhaps the biggest takeaway you should get from this is that fictional characters don't have actual human rights. There is no point in trying to fight for their fictional rights. Everything that happens to them in the show, regardless if it's good or bad, never actually happened. You're fighting a pointless battle by trying to fight for their own rights. Banning light novels for child exploitation is just fighting something that's really stupid. Instead of putting your actual effort into fighting real child exploitation, you're focusing on something that affects nobody. You're free to dislike lollies if you want. Nobody's forcing you to go and look at lollies. But at the end of the day, they're still not real people. They're not real children. They're not real 9,000-year-old vampires. And they're not real 500-year-old fucking sharks. They're fake. They are meant to be fake. They are not meant to resemble real people. If you think these are real children or real people being harmed, I think it says a lot more about you and how you view the world, as opposed to the people that you're detesting. Instead of putting all your energy into fighting for rights for fictional characters, put that energy into the real world and fight for rights for actual people, where people are actually being affected. Leave fiction alone, because nothing is happening there. There's nothing suggestive. They aren't trying to influence people to do things. Nothing harmful goes on, because at the end of the day, they are drawings on a piece of paper. Trying to tell people what they can and can't create is restricting creative freedom. So essentially, the major point of this video is to show that there is a big gap between fiction and reality. While art can imitate life and life can imitate art, they aren't supposed to be one and the same. A character dying in a show, or a character dying in a book, a character getting assaulted, etc., does not mean that somebody's actually being harmed, or that they're trying to influence you to go harm somebody, or that this is supposed to reflect an actual event that happened in real life. Fiction is allowed to use aspects of real life that might be considered harmful or sensitive, as it allows them to teach you a lesson. It might show you things you don't want to see, and it helps guide people to understand the horrors of the real world without actually having to experience it. This might sound very weird or messed up, but I think it's much better for these kinds of things to happen to a fictional character rather than a real person, as nobody's being affected. So all in all, I'm not saying you have to be okay with every piece of fiction that exists, because guess what? Not everything is made for everybody. If you don't like something that happens in a show or book that you're consuming, then guess what? You can turn it away and you can walk away from it. You don't have to consume it. Nobody is forcing you to consume these kinds of things. There's even some pieces of media like doujinshis that I'm not going to suggest to anybody that I find pretty disgusting, but I'm not going to call for them to be removed out of circulation, because there's coincidentally a market for that kind of thing. While it's something I don't necessarily agree with, it is fiction and nobody is actually being harmed in the process. I have to allow it to happen, and I think everybody should allow things just to happen in fiction, because nobody's actually being harmed. Unless the piece of fiction is trying to suggest you or influence you to do things, or is supposed to be representative of actual harmful real life events, such as a realistic drawing of a real child, then yes, that is when it breaks the boundary being harmful. But 99% of the time, this harmful content that is being targeted in anime is typically very, very inoffensive. Sword Art Online is one of the most vanilla and basic series ever, and the fact that it's getting targeted for child exploitation is beyond me, but that's for another time. But yeah, the major takeaway is separate fiction from reality. They are two separate entities. Fiction is an important tool to use in life, but it should never be looked at as actual fact, because that is exactly what fiction is not. Fiction is fake. It can be used to tell the truth of the world, but it is still through and through 100% fake. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video. Trying out new things with these videos. I'm mostly doing these for fun, but it is cool to see that people are actually watching it. So I do hope you guys enjoy. And if you want me to cover something, you can just tell me in the comments below. Yeah, thank you for listening, and go watch my podcast.